your panelists.
Thank you very much. It is my great privilege to be with you all this morning to talk about greening ICT4D. 2023 was the hottest year on record, and digital technology can and will play a role in climate change mitigation and adaptation. However, unchecked, it has the potential to cause just as much environmental harm as it does the good it will do. With me today, I have three expert panelists to sort of unpack this topic. We have Onica Makwakwa, who is the Executive Director at the Global Digital Inclusion Partnership, Morten Risgaard, the Head of Sales for UN and NGO at Danoffice IT, and Mariela Machado, the Senior Director for Humanitarian Tech and Tech for Good at IEEE and a professor at Columbia University. And they're going to help us unpack why this is important, where we are as a sector, and what we should be focusing on. So let's get right into it. Onica, considering your background in research and public policy on sustainable connectivity, why do we need to address the impact of ICTs have on environment and climate?
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me here. So it's really important for us to address this because climatic and digital inequalities actually have similar fault lines in terms of exclusion when you look at the impact of who is adversely impacted by climate change as well as who's excluded from digital development. But most importantly, environmental sustainability as well as access to infrastructure are both part of the SDGs that we have to accomplish by 2030. So we can chew gum and walk at the same time, meaning that we can actually address the infrastructure that we need for digital connectivity, as well as simultaneously address environmental issues within that. Because poor policy choices that we make today on connecting everyone have real environmental costs down the line. So it's not an either or, it's something that we have to invest in and do simultaneously.
Go ahead. Morten, as a member of the global supply chain, what are your perspectives on why this is important?
Well, thank you, Joel, and good morning, and thanks for letting me be a part of this. I mean, I am representing a commercial company, so I'm happy to be here and be a part of the family and not being seen as the enemy. But maybe the chocolates that are at our booth out here helps a little bit on that. But great to be here and be a part of this panel. Back to your question. First of all, I mean, we need to address this because we don't have a choice. You know, I mean, and that goes for the whole climate debate, and also as we heard before from Microsoft. I mean, this is not just one sector or some persons. I mean, we all have to work together on this. Commercial company, organizations, and from our side, being a supplier of IT equipment, we work closely with I would say in three phases. Of course, we try to put as much pressure on the manufacturers and producers as possible. So we know that when they're producing IT equipment, they're using renewable energy, that they're recycling it as much as possible. Then also when we come to the customer phase, the user phase, which accounts for about 80% of the CO2 footprint, we're trying to be advisors also to the customers, so they buy what they need and don't buy for overcapacity that will take a lot of extra energy. And then the third phase is the end of life phase, of course, and that's where we need to really work together and find solutions for recycling or even better reuse. So those are some of the aspects we're working on in that sense.
Yeah, Mariela, I feel like we wouldn't be doing service to the topic du jour, generative AI, if we didn't mention it on the Greening ICT4D panel. And we were talking about this yesterday when we were preparing. How should we be thinking about generative AI in the sort of around the topic of greening ICT? We know it's very resource intensive, very compute intensive. How does that play into our thinking about the importance of addressing environment and climate change in ICT4D?
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm also part of the engineering society and part of the engineering world, which sometimes is, not that embedded into this type of work. So I'm very happy to be here representing that voice. I think it's more pressing than ever with generative AI, and just going to speak, about one side of the story, being the infrastructure, and the infrastructure, that needs to grow by the minute. Now with generative AI being in its inception, it's starting. We're starting to see what it can do, and it will continue to grow. So the broadband, the infrastructure that is necessary to support that will continue to grow. And if we don't tackle, if we don't become greener in the infrastructure, it will continue to damage, and the carbon footprint will continue to increase. And just, to give more of a practical example, I'm just going to speak about data centers. Speaking about infrastructure I'm a telecommunications engineer myself, in my background before I transitioned into this field. And something that people don't realize, and I encourage you all to Google data centers and see pictures, how much hardware, how much cables, how much energy the data centers have. And now we're not only speaking about data centers, but hyper data centers. And those are growing by the minute. And I was actually seeing data, and this year we're going to have 300 more. So, the number is plus 300. The consumption in energy of these centers are doubling in less than 10 years in gigawatts. So, it's just something to keep in mind. At the same time, Joel, and before we move on, I do want to emphasize that AI, generative AI, not so much yet, maybe in the future, but AI is also trending in starting to establish the solutions that are mitigating and reducing the energy consumption of these data centers. So, we are using more energy for these data centers, but AI is also an enabling solution also to reduce the energy with like sensors and how to track the energy consumptions of these centers. So that's all, kind of the complexity of the increase and the emerging technologies and how that is playing out.
Right, thank you. Morten, given your position in the supply chain and all the conversations you have with the UN and INGOs like CRS, where is the sector's maturity in terms of addressing the impact of ICTs on the environment and climate?
Thanks, Joel. It's a question that's very difficult to quantify, but it's safe to say that we are not far enough. We need to move together faster. I think being on this panel and having this topic here really proves that it's about awareness, that it must be on the agenda, and it is on the agenda, and it needs to stay there. From our side, we are engaged in a setup where we do recycling and reuse of e-waste. Just 2 weeks ago, we were awarded a contract by the UN, the procurement division in New York, for e-waste collection from the peacekeeping missions in Africa that we're going to collect and recycle. So this is sort of first movers in that sense. It's like a pilot project because nobody really has the complete setup for it, but it's very interesting, and it's definitely a start. And we also feel like being a private company, being IT suppliers, we also need to be a part of the solution. So I'm really excited about this whole e-waste setup and project we're starting now with the UN.
Onica, any observations in your research and in your public policy advocacy around maturity?
I'll share insights from a 2021 report we did on sustainable connectivity, and and looking really at policy frameworks for making sure that we are sustainable in deploying infrastructure for connecting everyone. We reviewed over 70 national broadband plans. They definitely have the green language in them. Tick, however, action has not been consistent with that. So there's a lot of greenwashing that we've learned to do around this issue. So let me just share some very practical and not so difficult recommendations that are actually implemented in certain markets. One is a policy around a dig once policy. Senegal adopted this in 2018. And what that does is that it eliminates redundancy in construction within the country. So you are building a new neighborhood, you are digging to lay down electricity pipes, water pipes, or whatever. put the darts in and lay down the fiber. So you have a dig once policy, and you force your public works to coordinate, the civil work to make sure that we are digging once only and reducing the redundancy of that work. It also has the added advantage of lowering the cost, because we know that over 60% of deploying fiber, of deploying the internet is actually on the trenching. So imagine if you only trenched once, you are reducing the cost, but you are also helping the environment as well. The other one is having clear regulations around rights of way, but also around enabling active and passive infrastructure sharing so that smaller internet ISPs can be able to connect to your exchange, as well as community networks. That way, not everyone needs to build the infrastructure. Force the operators to share the infrastructure. Reducing customs and duty on infrastructure importation, especially to incentivize the use of renewable energy. Towers are using a lot of diesel as backup to the electricity if they are not connected. So creating a financing scheme and an incentive to force them to use renewable energy in order to keep the towers on in terms of electricity. But this issue of infrastructure sharing, we have no connectivity without electricity. It's a no-brainer. We really need to begin to look at regulating access in the same way as we regulate utilities, so that we also have some cost savings, but also some energy savings. E-waste has already been talked about, but I think we need to look at our consumer protection policies and really fight for a right to repair. We are a reuse market in Africa for the most part, and it's really unacceptable that we still have handheld devices that we don't have the right to repair. Right to repair would give us longevity and would actually slow down landfill waste that we are producing with these devices. And last but not least, creating supporting the use side. Connectivity is not good because of the infrastructure. The value of the connectivity lies in the actual use. We now have a continent where we have a growing user gap, meaning that more people living within a broadband connection, but not actually using it. That means that we also have to invest in the demand-side issues, such as digital skills, e-government, content through e-government content that we are generating that way, so that we are not just building towers and not focusing on actually increasing the use as a way to reduce the waste of that. So it's not a build it and they'll come. It's a build it and invest in the value of it, so that it really, there is a really good use case for all of that.
Thank you. Mariela, pivoting to action, and given maybe focusing on your position in research at Columbia, how is your organization addressing this particular challenge?
So I think we're sitting more on the side of advocacy, research, capacity building. To that point, how are we using these technologies and for what, and knowledge sharing. We sit more at the top in that sense, if you want to think more of a high level, and it's so needed. I'm actually now, by coincidence, I'm advising a research project at Columbia University for the European Development Bank and Reconstruction Bank. They want tangible case studies on digital solutions that are actually, mitigating climate change in a tangible way, and they want case studies that are practical and doing, positive in agriculture, manufacturing, and telecommunications. And, just looking at the data that we have found so far is just, we're so far away from where we need to be. These case studies are, a lot of greenwashing, a lot of companies saying, the AI is actually solving all the problems, in our facilities, and looking deeper at the data, we understand that we have a long way to go. And at the same time, we're seeing a trend, and that's what I mentioned at the beginning, on AI and emerging digital technologies, leaning on a lot of connectivity, actually supporting and decreasing the carbon footprint of what I mentioned before. So there's kind of a twofold there, and how are we going to continue to do this in all parts of the world? More of the case studies, one that is like very direct, one case study in Japan in agriculture, smart farming, was decreasing the carbon footprint by 40%. And we know the agriculture, especially the food systems with cows and how they eat, and we know about the meat carbon footprint, and they were reducing it by 40%. So how can we start enabling that? How can we start thinking about standards that need to be applied in the developing world with energy that it's not consistent, with connectivity that it's not, steady and it's not as it should be. Like we know now, that we didn't have connectivity for a couple of days. How are we getting there? So our role, and my role in academia as well, is actually to find those case studies and start creating those standards so that we can actually move forward. And especially the technical capacity is something that at IEEE we look very closely at and we're very focused on, because we do need to continue to train our engineers to do this work better and greener.
Morten, what is Danoffice IT doing? And maybe specifically, what should all of us in the room be asking? We all have suppliers of technology. What should we be asking you?
Well, I think there's always should be a discussion about what is the plan after end of life? Are we going to recycle or reuse the IT equipment? Until now, I mean, a lot of organizations and global customers, they haven't really had a strategy to what to do with the IT equipment after end of life. So maybe it end up in a warehouse or in a container or something like that. So we really have a big task for now, for cleaning up the IT equipment and make sure it doesn't end up in places we don't want it to end up. When the cleanup has been done, and that's a big task, then we have to make a plan for the next IT sales and purchases. So there's a plan for end of life. So maybe it'll be stored correctly end of life, and it can be resold, which is much greener when it comes to carbon footprint than just recycling. So that's some of the takeaways I would like you to, think about the strategy end of life when you're buying IT equipment.
Onica, thinking about public policy and advocacy, what is your organization doing in this space?
I think there's 3 points of intervention for policy when we look at greening the internet. One is at the network construction phase, and that's really around this issue of infrastructure sharing. In fact, the minister shared an example yesterday with us about the rural telephony initiative that they are funding through universal service and access funds. So there's also an opportunity for us to be innovative around how we use these funds to also address energy issues and infrastructure sharing within the sector. The other one is on the operational side, and that is, looking at using renewable energy for powering the towers or providing backup power for the towers. And lastly, it's network use. Again, the value of the internet is not measured by its infrastructure. It's going to be measured by the use of the internet that we are connecting people to. So we need to address the demand side issues that are causing the usage gap. Otherwise, we're just building towers. Especially in this continent, I believe we need another $109 billion for infrastructure to connect everyone to the internet. But if we have such a huge usage gap, is it really, it's an important investment, but it actually will come at a huge environmental cost if we don't address the demand side issues as well.
Thank you. Mariela, just as we sort of move towards the end of our panel, what is the one key takeaway or challenge you have for the audience around greening ICT4D, the one thing you'd like them to take away from this panel?
I think that the global north, and we're all trying to figure this out everywhere in the world, how are we gonna have ICT become greener? So I would encourage everyone here to start thinking about, in your specific jobs, in your roles, in ICT4D, how can you start thinking about policies or enabling, technologies that can help you mitigate your carbon footprint? And I will end with a positive note, from the telecommunications industry and in general the engineering industry. There's a push for 6G, and I don't know if you have heard. I know we're still speaking about 5G, but 6G is actually one of the main components is that it's green. So the towers are, supported by green energy. So I do feel that we're all moving towards the same direction. It's slower than we should, but just finishing with a good note. I think that 6G is in the works. It's something promising for at least the telecommunication and infrastructure industry that we lean on as ICT4D.
Same question to you. What's one takeaway or challenge for the audience?
Well, I mean, the challenges must be, I mean, have a strategy for when you purchase an IT equipment, have a strategy for end of life. What are you going to do in 3 or 5 years, and how are we going to together move from just calling it e-waste and recycling to reuse, and that starts when you're making the purchase. So that's the key for me.
And Onica, same question to you. One takeaway or one challenge?
Wow, this is really hard because I often feel like the people who are hit the hardest by climate change are also the ones who are contributing the least towards the crisis that we have, yet burdened the most in terms of making the adjustments that need to be made. But that said, long-term carbon costs really depend on policy choices that we make today. So I can't drive the point on sharing enough. Sharing is caring. Sharing the infrastructure is going to really be important. As an African, I often brag that we created the sharing economy. We just did not commercialize it. But we you know, it comes naturally as our way of living. It's a shared economy. And I think that we need to really begin to seriously think about regulating access to the internet in the same way we've regulated access to water and electricity, so that it's available for everyone, but deployed in an efficient and shared way. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other final thoughts from the panel? Any else that you'd like to impart to our audience today on greening ICT? All right, brilliant. Please join me, everybody, in thanking our panelists on this topic.